Hey guys, it's Coach Luke here. Just wanted to jump on and discuss some things that have come up. So I'm not too active in our Facebook group anymore. Coach Melissa handles most of that, but she gives me feedback, and I'll ask her like what's going on. It's not that I'm not in there. I just don't spend as much time in there as I used to. But anyway, she came to me and said, "Here's something that I've seen a little bit coming up in the Facebook group, and so maybe something that you should discuss." It is in the book, and it is in Hanson's Marathon Method. What I'm going to talk about today, though, I don't know if it matches up completely with what I have in the book, but that was probably 15 years ago. So things change, right? So, but the topic came up of matching uh, training volume to race expectations. Like, what should you expect if you train at a certain level? So I kind of broke it down more into, I know what I have in the book, and that was a little bit off experience, a little bit of things that I learned early on as a coach. That was very early in my coaching career. And then I started thinking about like, where am I at now with everything, with what I've seen. We've coached, tens of thousands of runners over the last 20 years. Where does that uh, academic number stand up with the practical number, right? So I think the interesting thing is, I think since I started coaching and now, is we've really seen a resurgence of more volume. Definitely seems so. It's completely anecdotal on my part, but I do feel like more and more people want to run more and more volume, which I love. I do think, especially if you're going to do training for marathons and things like that, more volume is ultimately going to be better, but also has to be in the right manner too, right? And so that's where I want to go with this. Like, what do you really need in order to accomplish something, right? So, but at first, before I go into that, I know what people are going to say. They're like, I ran X marathon doing a walk jog or running 3 days a week. And I totally get that. I've seen people do some really crazy good things off of not much training, right? And I've seen people have to, like, I have athletes right now who physically are limited in what they can do. And we have to get creative with how they're training, how much running they're actually doing. So I 100% get that. Don't think that I'm discounting that, but I'm saying on average for the vast majority of people, this is what I see, right? So don't give me any negative emails or anything like that, right? Because I get it, right? I know I've seen it, I've coached it. It is what it is. But I'm talking about the kind of the people in those in that bell curve who make up the vast majority of the what they have to do in order to reach a certain goal. Okay, so I know, but we're going to be talking about the majority of people here. So just some notes I have here. So the 5+ hour crew, and recently I haven't coached a lot of 5+ hour people in the last few years, but I have one right now, and I thought her case study was actually really good to kind of share. But it can overall, I think it can be tricky because you have a whole range of experience with these runners. Um, you can have somebody who's brand new to running. You can have somebody who's been running for a while. You can have somebody who's trying to run a marathon in order to, have this big bucket list thing checked off their list, as a manner of kind of really challenging themselves to change themselves from a health standpoint. So they're running a marathon just to cover ground, don't really know what to expect, all that good stuff. So you have a wide range of people in this group, and it can be tricky to coach this group because some people will expect being treated more like an experienced runner, but the reality is the training doesn't necessarily show that, right? And so the best I can say for this is using this athlete that I currently have, that just ran New York City actually. She came to me a little bit late in the game because she'd been like, she was pretty upset. One of my other athletes actually recommended her to me, or actually referred me to her. And I wasn't really sure, but she came to me and she was desperate. I don't know if I didn't want to push too hard, but she'd been either following a plan or had a coach or something. But she was literally in July at a point where she could only run 2 miles, and it was not straight running 2 miles. It was run walking 2 miles. And she had aspirations of running like 4:45 in the marathon. And I'm like, I just had to be upfront with her, like, honestly, that's not going to happen this time around. What we've got to just get ready to cover 26.2. Whatever the time is going to be whatever the time is, right? But we have to put you physically in a spot where you're going to be able to handle 26 miles, right? And so um, it was her first one. Expectations, I thought expectations were too high just for where she was. I think if we would have got started earlier, and we could have started, maybe a couple months before that, and I could have actually built her to the point where she could run 30, 40 minutes without stopping, she would have been fine. But I had to spend the next 8 to 10 weeks to get her to the point where she could run 30 to 45 minutes without stopping. And so that was the big challenge for us. But and just looking at her log, her first run with me was July 8th. And like I said, she couldn't cover 2 miles without walking, and she couldn't even really go much further than that, right? And so I just wanted to put that into a little bit of context into the situation. And then, so I had a few weeks of schedule for her. I quickly realized too much, it was too much for her. She was not tolerating it well. So we basically just scaled back, doing 5 to 10 minute jogs, small walk breaks. We started out with, I think, like 2 or 3 minute walk breaks, and I got her down to like 30-second walk breaks. And then we expanded the time that she could run before she needed a walk break. And so to her credit, from July 8th until October, she got to the point where she ran 16 miles. She didn't run it full straight on, but she ran walk. And I mean, it was literally like 45 minutes of running, 5 minutes of walking, 30 minutes of running, 5 minutes of walking, all the way down, right? So I would start her out, get her a big chunk early on, and then just kind of make those chunks smaller and smaller. But we were able to expand the distance out on those long runs quite a bit. So my point is, though, we shifted focus from weekly volume more to time on her feet, right? So I got her to the point where we built her weekly volume on roughly 6 hours a week, because that was roughly what she was going to have to take on marathon day. And if I could get her to 6+ hours a week, we'll see. Is it going to be all right? Whatever. I don't know. And so that's what we spent. So she was spending several weeks, most of August, or I'm going to say, excuse me, most of September and October, in that 5 to 6 hour range. She did have some business travel where she ended up missing some time, but overall it was pretty solid, right? And looking through her log, that's 5 to 6 hours averaged about 30 to 32 miles a week based on what she could do. So her average runs, including the run walk portions, would average like 13, 14 minutes a mile. And so it came out to be about 30, 32 miles a week. And so doing the extrapolation on that, there was no way I could expect her to get to somewhere like 40 to 45 miles a week based on the time, right? Because now you're talking about getting this thing out to like 8 hours of training a week. And if that was all she was going to do, that's all she could do, right? And so that other 2 hours was better spent because she was actually able to handle the training that I gave her, but also do things like core and stretching and things like that. So we could have got her probably up to 40 to 45 miles, but all that other stuff would have been neglected, right? And so I felt like there was more value in taking that extra 2 hours of the training and putting that into supplemental type of things, right? And I think that helped her, because she ended up running, I think she ended up running 6:30, which she was really happy with. Her biggest win of the day, though, was that she ran 13 miles without stopping. She ran the first 13 miles without stopping, and then the second half had to take her walk breaks in there. But overall, I thought she did really well going into it. From where we started to where she was able to finish that up, I thought she did really well. So that's kind of where I'm at. Like with that group, it's almost better probably to look at it more in terms of time on your feet. Build as much as you possibly, you can build up to a point where if you plan on running 5:30 in the marathon, get to where you can tolerate 5.5 hours of running a week, right? That would be where I would stand on that. And that's probably how I'm going to approach those situations going forward, right? I think that worked out really well for her, and I see the benefits in that. Okay, so moving on, 4 to 5 hour marathoners, a big range, but overall I think the volume is about the same here. For me, the minimum is 4 runs a week. She was going back to that 5+ hours. She was averaging 4 to 5 days a week, right? That's about what we were 2 days on, basically 2 days on, 1 day off, 2 days on, 1 day off, something to that effect, right? And then a long run, right? And that's kind of how we approach it. But going back to this, 4 days a week, which means you'll have most runs over an hour. and then you throw in a long run, you're talking about minimum, I would say minimum 35 miles per week. But I would love to see that push to 40 miles a week. If I can get that person to 40 miles a week, I think they're going to be able to do much better. I think that can take a person, it's closer to 5 hours, and push them more down to like 4:30 if they can average that 40 miles per week in their peak volume, right? Like, we're going to take time building up to that, and then we're going to spend a lot of time somewhere in that 35 to 40 range, right? Not every week's going to be at 40, but we'll be pretty close to that. And I say that because at this level, the intensity is going to be mostly moderate for most people. We're not necessarily doing a ton of really high intensity workouts. We're really still mostly focused on just building their endurance, right? So if we can build their endurance, get the weekly volume up, they're going to be able to tolerate that a lot better than if we try throwing in a bunch of intensity as well, right? And that intensity is really going to be very little bang for the buck for this person. So let's focus on what's going to get them the most benefit, get them into that range that they want to be. And then moving forward, ideally what we can do is start building into what we've established with that baseline foundation of fitness, right? So just getting back to this, to get to those ideal numbers, to get up to, so I would love to see it over 40 and peak close to 50 miles a week. That's closer to that 4-hour range. And if you're in that range, then you're going to have to probably go from 4 to 5 days per week. So if they run less than that, say 3 to 4 days per week, the primary emphasis has to be on building your general endurance. And I would also recommend doing some type of aerobic-based cross training too. So I have a lady right now who I also ran in New York City, has a lot of physical ailments, nothing that is training related, it's just life related, like has some back issues that have been there her whole life, right? And so she gets up to a certain mileage, and it just is a breaking point for her. So we really kind of scaled back to that 4 days a week, but she does a ton of walking. She does a ton of biking, gets on the elliptical every once in a while. But we supplement with what we can't do with training. From a running standpoint, we supplement that pretty hardcore with cross training. And she'll do mostly workouts with the running and a couple easy days. And then a lot of so it's like long run and maybe marathon pace work during this last segment. And then a lot of lighter intensity cross training, like on the bike and with walking and stuff like that. She can tolerate a ton of that. So we focus on that because that's what we can do. And she's done pretty well. I mean, it's not as fast as she wants to be. I think we made the mistake this past segment of making the segment too long, because she'd done really, really well in the spring. We're like, okay, let's just push the envelope. And I think we probably pushed it a little too hard. Probably should have been more like a 14-week segment, and we probably wouldn't have pushed past that breaking point as much. But we had a little bit longer, more like 18 to 20 weeks. And it was just too long for her. We were about 6 weeks too long on that. So that's what happened with that. But for the sake of this discussion, I'm going to say minimum 4 days a week and about 35 miles per week on average, with emphasis on building endurance over adding intensity. So that's for the 4 to 5 hour range. As you get closer to 4 hours, I would say that you will need to be closer to the higher end of my recommendation of volume and runs. If not, heavily incorporating cross training. That's what I would do. So the closer you are to 4 hours, the closer you need to be to 5 days a week and over 40 miles per week. And if you can't do over 40 miles a week, a lot of cross training, right? So that would be where I would suggest 3:30 to 4 group, 3:30 marathon to 4 hour marathoner. I've talked about this in the past, but I really feel like that 4 hour marathon is kind of that threshold where paces start lining up how we have them in the calculator. You get beyond that, paces don't really make a whole lot of sense, because it's all skewed a little bit, right? Again, that endurance has to be built up to a certain point for the paces to make sense, right? So that's right on there. But quickly on this range, to be in this goal range, we really start focusing on the whole aspect of training. So really more emphasis on, speed and strength, and then the marathon pace tempos, things like that, right? We can start incorporating those things a little bit more. More than that, those people are running at least 5 days a week. I would say the bare minimum would be 40 to 45 miles a week. Peak volume for this group, 45 to 50. Ton of success in that 3:30 to 4 range would be in that 45 to 50 peak mileage. So that's actually a little bit less than the Hanson's Marathon beginner plan. And so that's why I've always stressed too, that don't look at those. And if you're looking at the book and you say classic beginner, classic advanced, don't get caught up in beginner and advanced. Look at what the volume is and go with that fits you best, right? So if you're a 3:30 to 4 hour range, vast majority of people will be just fine in a beginner plan if the volume is that high, right? And that's definitely the case with Hansen's marathon method. I would not get caught up in the beginner or advanced. Most people who've run several marathons are better off in the beginner marathon plan because of the volume is more than what a traditional beginner plan would be. So just a side note there though. Just to recap though, 3:30 to 4 hour range, I'm looking mostly at 5 to 6 days a week of running. I would love to see you average 40 to 45 miles per week over that last 8 to 10 weeks. Peak volume, 45 to 50 miles per week. That's not going to be every week that last 8 weeks, but if you look at how the book plans are structured, every other week will be pretty close to that peak week over the last 8 weeks or so, right? And that's what I would like to see. So that would be ideal. And I've had a ton of success, like I said, a ton of success with that. 3 to 3:30 group. Once you're getting down to this range, most people I coach are at least 5 days a week. But given that this group is seen more, I feel like this group is more susceptible to overdoing mileage than most other groups, right? I get a ton of people who are sitting in that 3:30 range and all of a sudden they didn't hit it and they want to go from 50 to 60 to 70 plus. I actually got an email about it just this week. And somebody's like, oh, should I just add more miles? Like, you're literally adding more mileage to a person that doesn't need it, right? They do not need that mileage, right? And I was honest with them because I feel like it's better off just give them the flat out truth. They just poorly executed their race and they cooked their own bacon is what they did. Had nothing to do with the training. Hopefully they realize that. And, I said that out of love, but a lot of times people just get mad, but that's okay. But like I said, a lot of people overdo the mileage on this part. Like I'll use my wife as an example. She was in her early 40s, qualified for Boston. She was teaching kindergarten at the time, so she was limited time to train. And she ran 5 days a week. I think she took Wednesdays and Sundays off. So we did Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, I believe is what we did with her. Probably averaged 45 miles a week, ran 3:23 at Boston. So you can do it. I think a lot of times people get overdone on that. I mean, she was in the low 50s for peak volume, but average week of the segment was probably about 45 miles per week. And then she did 2 workouts a week and the rest were easy runs. So 2 workouts a week and 3 easy runs a week. And that was all she really did. And obviously somebody who's running that is probably has a history of fitness anyway. So we can probably get away with doing a little bit less miles because your aerobics your development is much further along. If you take a brand new runner and you say, oh, I'll run this 40 miles a week in your first time, probably not going to happen, right? But in any case, what I will see is runners get down to 320 or whatever the case is, somewhere in that range. They'll naturally keep progressing volume until they plateau out. And you will be surprised at how many people have actually come to me in this situation. Like, I want to qualify for Boston. Let's say they need 320. They've peaked out at 330. All they've done is just keep adding mileage or try to add more intensity, this and this and this. And I've actually backed them down from 55, 60 miles a week. I backed them down to what I recommended, and they'll take 10 minutes off, right? Just because they're a little bit more fresh. They were way overcooked with the mileage, and they actually allowed themselves to adapt to the training, recover from the training, and they did very, very well. Yeah, so like I said, I've backed people down from this range from 55 to 60 down to roughly 50 miles a week, and they would see big improvements. But I will say the closer you get to 3 hours, most of those people are usually pushing close to 60. That's where the advanced plan is really where you probably need to be, close to 60 miles a week, some weeks a little over, some weeks, 50 to 55, but your peak weeks in that 60, just north of 60 range on that. And that's pretty universal for men and women in that range. It didn't really matter. But like I said, I get countless reports yearly from people. And if you go in that Facebook group and you see how people are using the plan and running, 3 hours, 3:10 in that range, a lot of people are doing that. A lot of age groups are doing that. Men and women are both doing that. Sub 3. So now we're getting kind of more into that, local elite, regional elite level, right? You're doing pretty well at marathons, potentially winning some marathons, placing in the top couple hundred at majors, things like that. But for the vast majority of these athletes, for me, they've all averaged 55 to 60 miles a week. I had three or four guys run that wanted to run like 250 to 255. And they were all averaging about 55 miles a week. Peak mileages were 60 to 65. Some got close to 70, but that was only touched it just a couple weeks. But then this is where they would do more the longer long runs, more complicated long runs, so we would do more Squires type long runs and stuff like that. So we didn't add a ton of volume. We just got creative with more of the workouts that we were doing too. And I will say this, everyone that I coach in this range is not, their mileage is plenty high at that 65 range. But they are all doing strength training. They all do a little bit of mobility stuff. They're all doing strides, things like that. So it's not necessarily about the mileage at that point. It's making sure that those supplemental activities are done. Kind of like the 5-hour plus group where, like with my athlete, was that 2 hours spent better doing more volume, or was it making sure they were going to be resilient with strength training and stuff like that? Kind of the same thing here, right? That the extra time that we could add more mileage, and eventually we probably will with these guys, but right now it's better spent to make sure they're focused on their strength training stuff, because they all work full-time jobs. They're all got families and things like this. So we have to balance what does it make sense, what is going to give us more bang for the buck. They're already doing very well with the volume. So let's take what extra time we have. Instead of adding afternoon runs, let's add 30 minutes of strength or 30 minutes of mobility, whatever the case is. So that's where a big caveat to that group there. So they could run more mileage. I don't think they wouldn't be able to tolerate it, but I think they're better served doing the other things, right? Let's see, what else do I have here? I'll see a fair number on the cusp of this group that want to add more volume. And again, I want to go back to that. It's easy to overdo the volume at this point too. Main theory you're seeing here is like, don't push the volume till you've maxed out what you've gotten it from that volume, right? You could spend a couple, 3 years at that volume before you've really truly maxed it out. And then if you've really done all those other things and you've kind of stalled out improvement, yeah, then let's go up to 70, 80 miles a week. But until that point, I don't think there's a need to necessarily do it. Sub 245 group, and this is where we will end. This is where things get exponentially harder, right? And so I'll use Gil as an example. Gil's an athlete of mine. We've been together for 8 years, hard to believe, right? So he came to me 345, and he sends me a fiscal year end report, whatever the case is. He does it for work, so he just does one for me as well. And he'll put our stats in there, and it's pretty interesting. So he was saying, so he came to me at 345. It took 2 years to go from 345 to 305. Didn't take long at all. But it took 6 years to go from 305 to 250, low 250s, right? Now, to be fair, he's had like 4 or 5 deployments in there, all those other things. So it wasn't like he missed, it was more like he couldn't run races some of the times, right? So there is some caveat, but the point is, you're in that 4-hour range. You can go to 315 in a relatively short period of time, but the faster you get, the harder it's going to be to see those results go the way it could take a lot more effort and a lot more getting creative with stuff to take 2 minutes off at 3 hours than it did to go from 345 to 305, right? And that's kind of what I wanted to take away from there. So here's where it gets tough for most of the people I work with. Like I said, they're working full time, they have families, all that good stuff, right? How do we manage going to like 75, 80 miles a week and staying balanced with everything else, not put ourselves over the edge, not create a situation where, yeah, we're training more miles, but now we're taking away from being able to recover, things like that. So that's always the thing. So again, I go back to, let's maximize what we can get out of the volume that we're currently at first before we just start adding more volume, right? But I do think you get under that 245 range, you're looking at 70 miles a week at the bare minimum. Thinking of Ben, who had just coached here in 238 at Boston, kind of came out of nowhere. We were thinking a couple minutes, like low 240s, but he just crushed it. And And yeah, I think he was about 70, 75 miles a week on average. Really solid workouts were big. The big thing here is like he did a lot of big runs. Most of his runs were 10 miles plus, which put him at well over an hour a run every day, right? And there was a lot of days where he was running closer to an hour and a half. We did break it up a little bit. He had a few days a week where he would do like 8 to 10 in the morning and then 4 in the afternoon, something like that during his peak weeks. So it does. And that's the balance you're going to have to make. But in a perfect world, yeah, I would say get up to like 80, 85 miles a week. As you start getting closer and closer to that like marathon trial standard, now you're talking about 90 plus miles a week, right? So, and it's gonna be a lot more work to get a lot less gains on your performance, right? So that's the big thing. All right, so just to close, I think the big takeaway should be maximize what you're doing at the level you are currently doing before jumping to a new mileage level. Don't automatically assume to get better, I need to jump in mileage. Sometimes it's just breaking that volume up differently. Maybe it's just spreading workouts out more. Maybe it's just switching out workouts. Maybe it's just building your base a little bit better, adding strength, adding mobility, stuff like that. All those things, look at those things first before automatically going to mileage. And don't take it wrong. I love mileage. You're talking to a guy who's run over 100,000 miles in his life. I had a decade where I ran 50,000 miles in a decade, right? So you do the math on that. It's 5,000 miles a year. It's not like I don't believe in mileage or do mileage, or used to do mileage, not so much anymore. But that's the thing. You've got to look at everything. Don't do mileage just for the sake of mileage when there's other things that maybe you should be doing that's going to help you more, right? And I think too, if you can kind of get in that mindset, once you do increase your volume, you can, instead of increasing 10 miles a week, you probably only need to increase like 5 miles a week to see benefit from it, right? So you can gradually ratchet that up. And ultimately what that's going to do is it's going to extend out the time that you're going to be able to see increased performance, right? If you can spend 5 to 10 years just gradually ratcheting that up, I am pretty sure you're going to see improvement that entire time, because you didn't just go straight from 0 to 100, plateau out, get burnt out, and then you're not even enjoying the sport anymore. You just bypassed all those levels, and you can't really go back to it. Once you're past it, it's kind of like you're gonna take a lot longer to go back and then restart. But ultimately, that's probably what some people will have to do. But in any case, just take that as a guide. Just take, that's coming more from personal experience as a coach, what I've seen over the last 15 plus years. Take it, lead with that, and then see where you're at. And then if you still have plateaued out, yeah, then ratchet up the volume. But I just see it so many times that people automatically just want to jump the mileage up, and it's not the mileage that they need to be worried about. It's anything from race execution to fueling during the race, fueling during training, adding strength, adding mobility. Those are the things that need to, and those things, once you have those done, and those are your foundational things that you can do really well without really much thought at some point, then adjusting the mileage is going to be the easy part, right? Because all that stuff's going to allow you to absorb that training so much better, right? All right, so take that with a grain of salt, but that's kind of, my guidelines on where I've seen people succeed and see where they fall into that performance spectrum of marathon times. So yeah, hopefully that helps some people out, gives you something to think about as you're hopefully in a base period now and starting to think about what you're going to be doing in the next year or so. So, all right, that's it for now. Any questions on anything I talked about? Feel free to post comments, under the video, or any one of our communities that we have. So, all right, I'll talk to you later. See ya.